Sympatric speciation. Detailed explanation. Sympatric speciation is a type of speciation that occurs when new species evolve from a single ancestral species while living in the same geographical area. Unlike allopatric speciation, which requires physical barriers to gene flow, sympatric speciation occurs without such geographic isolation. In sympatric speciation, reproductive isolation arises due to ecological, behavioral, or other mechanisms that reduce gene flow within a population, even though individuals continue to occupy the same area. Key concepts in sympatric speciation: no geographic isolation. In contrast to allopatric speciation, sympatric speciation occurs in the same geographical area. Populations do not face physical barriers like mountains or rivers, yet they become reproductively isolated due to other mechanisms. Ecological divergence. One of the primary drivers of sympatric speciation is ecological divergence. This refers to different populations exploiting different ecological niches within the same environment. For example, a population of insects might begin to specialize on different types of food plants, leading to changes in behavior, morphology, and physiology. Over time, this ecological differentiation can lead to reproductive isolation. Reproductive isolation. For sympatric speciation to occur, the population must experience reproductive isolation without physical barriers. This isolation can be achieved through various mechanisms. Behavioral isolation. Differences in mating behaviors, such as timing of mating or mate preferences, can lead to reproductive isolation. Temporal isolation. Different mating times can prevent interbreeding, even though individuals are in the same area. Mechanical isolation. Physical differences in reproductive organs may prevent successful mating. Genetic incompatibility. Over time, genetic differences can accumulate, leading to reproductive isolation. Polyploidy. Polyploidy, especially in plants, is a well-documented mechanism of sympatric speciation. Polyploidy occurs when an organism acquires more than 2 sets of chromosomes, often due to errors in cell division. This can result in immediate reproductive isolation from the parent population because the polyploid organism cannot interbreed with the diploid individuals. Polyploidy is particularly common in plants, and many plant species are polyploid. Mechanisms leading to sympatric speciation. Ecological niches. In sympatric speciation, different ecological niches can create barriers to gene flow even in the absence of physical separation. For example, different food sources or microhabitats within the same area may lead to the divergence of populations. If different groups within the same population exploit different resources, they may accumulate differences in their genetic makeup over time. Sexual selection. Sexual selection can also contribute to sympatric speciation. If individuals within a population develop distinct mating preferences for certain traits, such as color or size, those preferences can create reproductive isolation. For example, individuals of one color may preferentially mate with others of the same color, leading to assortative mating and divergence over time. Behavioral changes. Changes in behavior, such as feeding habits, timing of reproduction, or territoriality, can also contribute to reproductive isolation. For example, 2 groups of birds may begin to occupy different habitats or forage at different times of day, leading to less contact and opportunities for interbreeding. Polyploidy. Polyploidy is a major mechanism of sympatric speciation in plants. Polyploidy can result from errors in meiosis or mitosis that lead to the formation of individuals with multiple sets of chromosomes. A common form of polyploidy is autopolyploidy, where an individual has more than 2 sets of chromosomes from the same species. These polyploid individuals are often reproductively isolated from the diploid population, even though they live in the same area. Example of sympatric speciation. Cichlid fish in African lakes. A classic example of sympatric speciation involves cichlid fishes in East African lakes, such as Lake Victoria and Lake Tanganyika. These lakes are home to a large number of cichlid species, many of which have evolved through sympatric speciation. Cichlids have diversified into different ecological niches based on feeding habits, mating behaviors, and other factors. Some cichlids are adapted to feeding on algae, while others feed on smaller fish or invertebrates. Despite being in the same lake, these different feeding preferences have led to reproductive isolation and the formation of new species. Strengths and evidence for sympatric speciation. Polyploidy in plants. Polyploidy is a well-documented and widely studied mechanism of sympatric speciation. Many plant species, such as certain grasses and flowering plants, have arisen via polyploidy. Ecological differentiation. Evidence of ecological differentiation, such as changes in habitat preference or food selection, supports the role of ecological forces in speciation. This has been observed in various species, including insects and fish. Behavioral isolation. Studies of sexual selection and mate preferences show that behavioral changes can lead to reproductive isolation without geographic barriers. Challenges in sympatric speciation. Rarity of observed cases. Sympatric speciation is much rarer than allopatric speciation, and many cases of suspected sympatric speciation could actually involve incidental geographic isolation or other underlying mechanisms. Difficulty in detection. Since sympatric speciation occurs in the absence of geographic isolation, it can be difficult to detect. The process might be gradual and may require long periods of time to result in complete reproductive isolation. Practice question 1, GATE 2020. Which of the following is the most likely mechanism for sympatric speciation in plants? A. Geographical isolation leading to genetic drift. B. Differences in mating time leading to temporal isolation. C. A sudden increase in chromosome number leading to polyploidy. D. Different food preferences leading to reproductive isolation. Answer. The correct answer is C. A sudden increase in chromosome number leading to polyploidy. Polyploidy is a common mechanism for sympatric speciation, especially in plants. The increase in chromosome number causes reproductive isolation from the parent population. Practice question 2, GATE 2017. Which of the following best describes sympatric speciation? A. Speciation due to physical barriers. B. Speciation that occurs in a single geographical area without isolation. C. Speciation due to natural selection acting on isolated populations. D. Speciation due to genetic drift and the founder effect. Answer. The correct answer is B. Speciation that occurs in a single geographical area without isolation. Sympatric speciation occurs in the same geographical area, without geographic barriers, typically due to ecological or behavioral factors. Summary. Sympatric speciation is the formation of new species without geographic isolation. It typically occurs due to ecological differentiation, behavioral isolation, or genetic changes such as polyploidy. While more difficult to observe directly than allopatric speciation, sympatric speciation contributes significantly to the biodiversity we see today. Polyploidy in plants and ecological niche differentiation are two of the most important mechanisms driving sympatric speciation. Let me know if you'd like to proceed with more details or explanations on any specific topic. You said, next. ChatGPT said, ChatGPT. Parapatric speciation, detailed explanation. Parapatric speciation is a form of speciation that occurs when a small, isolated population at the periphery of a larger population becomes reproductively isolated and evolves into a distinct species. This type of speciation is similar to allopatric speciation but differs in that it typically involves small, peripheral populations rather than large, geographically separated ones. Key concepts in parapatric speciation: peripheral isolates. In parapatric speciation, a small group of individuals from a larger population becomes isolated at the edges of the species range. These isolated populations are often subject to different selective pressures than the parent population. This isolation can result from factors like geographical barriers, changes in habitat, or even the migration of a small subset of individuals to a new environment. Founder effect. The founder effect plays a crucial role in parapatric speciation. When a small group of individuals colonizes a new, peripheral habitat, they carry with them only a subset of the genetic diversity of the original population. This small gene pool can lead to genetic drift, where random changes in allele frequencies in the isolated population play a significant role in shaping the population's genetic structure. Over time, this genetic divergence can lead to speciation. Genetic drift. Genetic drift is especially significant in parapatric speciation because the small size of the peripheral population means that random fluctuations in allele frequencies have a stronger impact. This can lead to the loss of genetic diversity in the isolated population and promote divergence from the parent population. Selection and adaptation. The isolated population may be subject to different environmental conditions than the parent population. Natural selection acting on the unique ecological pressures of the new environment can lead to adaptations that are different from those in the main population. This can result in phenotypic and genetic differences between the isolated population and the parent population. Reproductive isolation. As the peripheral population evolves in isolation, it may develop reproductive barriers that prevent interbreeding with the parent population. These barriers could include behavioral differences, genetic incompatibilities, or physical differences in reproductive structures. Over time, these reproductive isolating mechanisms contribute to speciation. Mechanisms driving parapatric speciation: founder effect. When a small group of individuals establishes a new population, they bring with them only a subset of the genetic diversity of the parent population. Parapatric speciation is a form of speciation that occurs when a small, isolated population at the periphery of a larger population becomes reproductively isolated and evolves into a distinct species. This type of speciation is similar to allopatric speciation but differs in that it typically involves small, peripheral populations rather than large, geographically separated. Concepts in parapatric speciation: peripheral isolates. Parapatric speciation, a small group of individuals from a larger population becomes isolated at the edges of the species range. These isolated populations are often subject to different selective pressures than the parent population. This isolation can result from factors like geographical barriers, changes in habitat, or even the migration of a small subset of individuals to a new environment. Founder effect. The founder effect plays a crucial role in parapatric speciation. When a small group of individuals colonizes a new, peripheral habitat, they carry with them only a subset of the genetic diversity of the original population. This small gene pool can lead to genetic drift, where random changes in allele frequencies in the isolated population play a significant role in shaping the population's genetic structure. Over time, this genetic divergence can lead to speciation. Genetic drift. Genetic drift is especially significant in parapatric speciation because the small size of the peripheral population means that random fluctuations in allele frequencies have a stronger impact. This can lead to the loss of genetic diversity in the isolated population and promote divergence from the parent population. Selection and adaptation. The isolated population may be subject to different environmental conditions than the parent population. Natural selection acting on the unique ecological pressures of the new environment can lead to adaptations that are different from those in the main population. This can result in phenotypic and genetic differences between the isolated population and the parent population. Reproductive isolation. As the peripheral population evolves in isolation, it may develop reproductive barriers that prevent interbreeding with the parent population. These barriers could include behavioral differences, genetic incompatibilities, or physical differences in reproductive structures. Over time, these reproductive isolating mechanisms contribute to speciation. Mechanisms driving parapatric speciation: founder effect. When a small group of individuals establishes a new population, they bring with them only a subset of the genetic diversity of the parent population. This limited gene pool means that genetic drift will have a more profound effect on the evolution of the new population, which can increase the likelihood of divergence. Genetic drift. In small populations, random changes in allele frequencies, genetic drift, have a much stronger impact than in large populations. Drift can lead to the fixation or loss of alleles that would be unlikely to reach fixation in a large population, contributing to the genetic divergence between the two populations. Environmental differences. The small, peripheral population often faces different environmental conditions than the main population. These new selective pressures can lead to local adaptation, where traits that are beneficial for survival in the new environment become more common. This environmental divergence can increase the genetic and phenotypic differences between the isolated population and the parent population. Reproductive isolation. Over time, the isolated population may experience reproductive isolation from the main population. This can be due to behavioral changes, such as mating rituals, genetic incompatibilities, such as differences in chromosome number or structure, or ecological factors, such as timing of reproduction or habitat preference. As these isolating mechanisms develop, speciation can occur. Examples of parapatric speciation. London underground mosquitoes, Culex pipiens. A well-known example of parapatric speciation involves the London underground mosquitoes. These mosquitoes are genetically distinct from their counterparts living outside the underground, even though they inhabit the same geographical region. The isolation of the underground population has led to the development of distinct traits such as a preference for mating in the absence of light, a shift in feeding habits, and the development of genetic differences that have led to reproductive isolation. Island species. Small populations of animals or plants on islands often experience parapatric speciation. For example, species on Galapagos Islands, such as Darwin's finches, may evolve in isolation on different islands. The small populations on each island may adapt to local environmental conditions and become reproductively isolated from populations on other islands. Divergence of dogs and wolves. A more theoretical example can be seen in the divergence of domestic dogs from their wolf ancestors. If a small group of wolves became isolated from the main population, perhaps due to migration into new environments or human intervention, natural selection and genetic drift could cause them to diverge significantly from the ancestral wolf population. Strengths and evidence for parapatric speciation. Genetic evidence. Genetic studies of isolated populations can show evidence of divergence due to genetic drift, founder effect, and local adaptation. Ecological divergence. Evidence of adaptation to different ecological niches in isolated populations supports the idea that different environmental pressures can drive speciation in peripheral populations. Reproductive isolation. Behavioral and morphological differences that lead to reproductive isolation are commonly observed in isolated populations. Challenges in parapatric speciation. Small population sizes. Small populations are more susceptible to extinction, which makes studying parapatric speciation more challenging. If a population goes extinct before it can diverge, there may be no evidence of speciation. Detecting speciation. Parapatric speciation may be difficult to observe directly because the isolated population may not be completely genetically isolated until much later in the process. Practice question 1, GATE 2018. In parapatric speciation, the key factor that leads to speciation is a complete geographical isolation of a small population. B. Genetic drift and selection in a small, isolated population. C. Ecological divergence in different habitats. D. Interbreeding between small populations and the parent population. Answer. The correct answer is B. Genetic drift and selection in a small, isolated population. Parapatric speciation occurs when a small, isolated population undergoes genetic drift and natural selection, leading to the divergence and eventual formation of a new species. Practice question 2, GATE 2019. The founder effect in parapatric speciation can lead to a. The loss of genetic variation in the founder population. B. The immediate formation of new species without isolation. C. An increase in genetic variation through mutation. D. No significant change in allele frequencies in the population. Answer. The correct answer is at the loss of genetic variation in the founder population. The founder effect occurs when a small group of individuals forms a new population, carrying only a subset of the genetic diversity of the parent population. This can lead to a loss of genetic variation and increased divergence due to genetic drift. Summary. Parapatric speciation occurs when small populations become isolated at the periphery of a species range, often due to genetic drift, the founder effect, and local adaptation. Over time, these isolated populations can diverge genetically and phenotypically, leading to the formation of new species. This type of speciation highlights the importance of small, isolated populations in evolutionary processes. Let me know if you'd like to explore more on any specific aspects or move to the next topic. You said, next. ChatGPT said, ChatGPT. Sympatric speciation, detailed explanation. Sympatric speciation occurs when new species arise from a single parent species while inhabiting the same geographical region. Unlike allopatric speciation, which involves geographic isolation, or parapatric speciation, which involves peripheral isolation, sympatric speciation does not require physical barriers to gene flow. Instead, it is driven by factors such as ecological divergence, behavioral changes, or genetic changes that create reproductive isolation within a single, continuous population. Key concepts in sympatric speciation, ecological divergence. Sympatric speciation often arises when a population splits into distinct ecological niches within the same environment. This ecological divergence can lead to different selective pressures acting on different subgroups of the population, ultimately causing them to evolve separately. Disruptive selection. Disruptive selection plays a key role in sympatric speciation. It occurs when individuals at both extremes of a trait distribution have higher fitness than individuals with intermediate traits. This can lead to the formation of two distinct groups within the population that are adapted to different ecological niches. Reproductive isolation. As ecological niches evolve within the same geographical area, individuals from different subgroups may become reproductively isolated from one another. This reproductive isolation can occur through a variety of mechanisms, including temporal isolation, differences in mating times, behavioral isolation, differences in mating preferences, and mechanical isolation, physical differences that prevent mating. Polyploidy. A special mechanism in sympatric speciation is polyploidy, particularly in plants. Polyploidy occurs when an organism gains one or more extra sets of chromosomes. This can result in instant reproductive isolation from the parent population, as polyploid individuals can no longer successfully mate with diploid individuals. Polyploidy is especially common in plants but has also been observed in some animal species. Assortative mating. Assortative mating is another mechanism that can drive sympatric speciation. This occurs when individuals with similar phenotypic traits preferentially mate with each other. Over time, assortative mating can lead to genetic divergence between the subgroups within the population, ultimately resulting in speciation. Mechanisms driving sympatric speciation, ecological factors. In some cases, changes in the environment or the occupation of new niches by certain members of the population can lead to the establishment of reproductive isolation. For example, some individuals may specialize in feeding on a particular type of resource or occupy a different microhabitat within the same general environment. Disruptive selection. Disruptive selection is one of the most significant evolutionary forces driving sympatric speciation. It promotes the survival of individuals at both extremes of a trait spectrum, which creates two distinct groups within the same population. These groups may then become reproductively isolated due to differences in behavior, morphology, or ecological requirements. Polyploidy. Polyploidy can create instant reproductive isolation. For instance, if a mutation results in an individual having twice the normal number of chromosomes, that individual would be reproductively isolated from the original population. Polyploidy is particularly common in plants, where it can lead to the formation of new species in a single generation. Behavioral isolation. Behavioral differences, such as changes in mating rituals, can also contribute to sympatric speciation. If two groups within the same population develop distinct mating behaviors, such as different courtship songs or visual signals, they may no longer recognize each other as potential mates, even though they live in the same area. Temporal isolation. Temporal isolation occurs when two groups within a population reproduce at different times. For example, one group may breed earlier in the season, while another group breeds later, preventing interbreeding and leading to reproductive isolation. This can eventually lead to speciation. Examples of sympatric speciation: cichlid fish in African Great Lakes. In the African Great Lakes, e.g., Lake Victoria, a large number of cichlid fish species have arisen through sympatric speciation. Different populations have adapted to different ecological niches within the same lake, such as different types of food sources or habitats. Behavioral and morphological differences have led to reproductive isolation, resulting in the emergence of new species. Apple maggot fly, Rhagoletis pomonella. The apple maggot fly provides a well-studied example of sympatric speciation. Originally, the fly laid its eggs on hawthorn trees, but some individuals began laying eggs on apples, which were introduced by humans. Over time, the flies that preferred apples developed behavioral differences from those that preferred hawthorns, leading to reproductive isolation and the eventual formation of a new species. Polyploid speciation in plants. Polyploidy is a well-known mechanism of sympatric speciation in plants. An example is the oats Avena genus, where polyploidy has led to the formation of new species. Polyploid plants are reproductively isolated from their diploid ancestors because they cannot interbreed successfully with them. Strengths and evidence for sympatric speciation. Genetic evidence. Genetic studies of symmetrically evolving populations can reveal divergence at the molecular level even in the absence of geographical barriers. Ecological and behavioral differences. Sympatric speciation can be supported by evidence of ecological or behavioral differences between subgroups of a population, which prevent gene flow. Polyploidy. Polyploidy, especially in plants, is a direct and observable mechanism of sympatric speciation that has been documented in many species. Challenges in sympatric speciation. Difficulty in observation. Sympatric speciation is challenging to observe directly because speciation occurs without physical barriers. It often requires long periods to accumulate enough genetic or phenotypic divergence. Intermediate forms. In some cases, intermediate forms may still be capable of interbreeding, making it harder to define when reproductive isolation occurs. Practice question 1, GATE 2020. Which of the following is not a mechanism of sympatric speciation? A. Polyploidy. B. Disruptive selection. C. Temporal isolation. D. Geographical isolation. Answer. The correct answer is D. Geographical isolation. Geographical isolation is associated with allopatric speciation, not sympatric speciation, which occurs without geographical barriers. Practice question 2, GATE 2018. Sympatric speciation in plants can result from A. Polyploidy leading to reproductive isolation. B. Geographic isolation causing different selective predators. C. Mating between different species leading to hybridization. D. The formation of new ecological niches due to environmental changes. Answer. The correct answer is A. Polyploidy leading to reproductive isolation. Polyploidy can result in immediate reproductive isolation, leading to sympatric speciation in plants. Summary. Sympatric speciation is a form of speciation that occurs within a single population in the same geographical region. It can result from ecological divergence, disruptive selection, polyploidy, and reproductive isolation mechanisms such as behavioral and temporal isolation. While harder to observe than allopatric speciation, sympatric speciation is supported by genetic, ecological, and behavioral evidence in many species. Let me know if you'd like to continue with more topics or have any specific questions. You said, next. ChatGPT said, ChatGPT. Allopatric speciation, detailed explanation. Allopatric speciation is the most widely recognized and common form of speciation. It occurs when a population of a single species becomes geographically isolated into two or more subpopulations, which then evolve separately due to different selective pressures, genetic drift, and mutation. Over time, these isolated populations accumulate genetic differences, leading to the development of reproductive isolation and the formation of new species. Key concepts in allopatric speciation, geographic isolation. The first step in allopatric speciation is the physical separation of a population into distinct geographic regions. These regions can be separated by various natural barriers such as mountains, rivers, oceans, or deserts. Geographic isolation prevents gene flow between the subpopulations, which is crucial for the speciation process. Genetic drift. In isolated populations, genetic drift can have a significant impact, especially in small populations. Genetic drift refers to random changes in allele frequencies due to chance events. Over time, genetic drift can lead to differences in the genetic makeup of isolated populations, even in the absence of natural selection. Natural selection. As the subpopulations adapt to their distinct environments, natural selection may act differently on each population. For example, different climates, food sources, or predators in the isolated regions may favor different traits. This divergence can further accelerate genetic differences between the populations. Reproductive isolation. After prolonged separation, genetic and behavioral differences accumulate between the populations, leading to reproductive isolation. This means that individuals from the two populations can no longer mate successfully, either because they do not recognize each other as potential mates or because their genetic differences prevent successful reproduction. Types of geographic barriers. Physical barriers, mountains, rivers, oceans, deserts, etc., can create physical separation between populations. Climatic barriers. Different climate conditions can form a barrier. For example, a change in temperature or precipitation can separate two subpopulations that prefer different habitats. Behavioral barriers. Changes in behavior, such as migration patterns, can isolate populations and prevent gene flow. Mechanisms driving allopatric speciation. Founder effect. The founder effect occurs when a small group from the original population colonizes a new, isolated environment. This small group may carry only a subset of the genetic diversity of the original population, and genetic drift can rapidly change the allele frequencies in the new population, initiating the process of speciation. Vicariance events. Vicariance refers to the splitting of a population by a new geographic barrier, such as the formation of a river or mountain range. Over time, the populations on either side of the barrier evolve independently due to reduced gene flow, which can lead to the formation of new species. Adaptive radiation. In some cases, allopatric speciation is accompanied by adaptive radiation, where the isolated populations rapidly diversify into a variety of forms that adapt to different ecological niches. This often occurs when a population is introduced to a new environment with unfilled niches, providing the opportunity for multiple species to evolve from a common ancestor. Examples of allopatric speciation. Darwin's finches, Galapagos Islands. Darwin's finches are a classic example of allopatric speciation. The finches of the Galapagos Islands evolved from a common ancestor, but as the finches dispersed to different islands, geographic isolation and differing ecological conditions, such as food availability, led to the development of new species. Natural selection favored different beak shapes and sizes depending on the types of food available on each island. Kaibab and Abert squirrels, Grand Canyon. The Kaibab squirrels provide an example of speciation due to a geographic barrier, the Grand Canyon. These two squirrel species were once part of a single population but became isolated on either side of the Grand Canyon. Over time, differences in their environments and genetic drift led to reproductive isolation and the formation of two distinct species. American bison and European bison. The American bison and European bison are examples of species that diverged due to geographical separation. Once connected by land bridges or continuous habitat, the two populations became isolated due to the separation by rivers and climatic factors, leading to the formation of two distinct species. Strengths and evidence for allopatric speciation. Geographic evidence. The presence of similar species on opposite sides of geographic barriers, with genetic differences between them, strongly supports allopatric speciation. Genetic evidence. Genetic studies of populations on either side of a barrier often reveal distinct genetic differences, supporting the idea of independent evolution. Complex interactions. Allopatric speciation is not always straightforward. In some cases, isolated populations may still maintain some level of gene flow or hybridize, making the speciation process more complex. Slow process. The process of allopatric speciation can take long periods of time, especially when the initial geographic isolation is not complete or when there is still some gene flow between the populations. Practice question 1, GATE 2021. Which of the following is a primary mechanism for allopatric speciation? A. Geographic isolation. B. Polyploidy. C. Temporal isolation. D. Behavioral isolation. Answer. The correct answer is a geographic isolation. Allopatric speciation occurs when a population is geographically isolated, preventing gene flow and leading to the evolution of new species. Practice question 2, Gate 2019. The formation of new species through allopatric speciation is primarily due to a. Reduced gene flow due to physical barriers. B. Ecological factors driving reproductive isolation. C. Behavioral changes leading to isolation. D. Mating at different times of the year. Answer. The correct answer is a. Reduced gene flow due to physical barriers. Allopatric speciation involves the geographic isolation of populations, which reduces or eliminates gene flow and leads to the formation of new species over time. Summary. Allopatric speciation is a key evolutionary process in which a single population becomes geographically isolated, preventing gene flow and leading to the formation of Allopatric speciation is a key evolutionary Allopatric speciation is a key evolutionary Allopatric speciation is a key evolutionary process in which a single population becomes geographically isolated, preventing gene flow and leading to the formation of new species. This process is driven by factors such as This process is driven by factors such as This process is driven by factors such as geographic isolation. This process is driven by factors such as geographic isolation, genetic drift, natural selection, and reproductive isolation. Classic examples, like Darwin's finches and the squirrels of the Grand Canyon, illustrate how geographical separation can lead to the divergence of species. Allopatric speciation is supported by extensive genetic, geographic, and fossil evidence. Let me know if you'd like to continue with more topics or have specific questions. You said, next. ChatGPT said, ChatGPT. Sympatric speciation, detailed explanation. Sympatric speciation is a form of speciation where a new species arise within the same geographic area, without any physical barriers separating the populations. Unlike allopatric speciation, which relies on geographic isolation, sympatric speciation occurs when a population diverges into two or more distinct species while living in the same environment. This type of speciation is less common but still plays a critical role in the diversification of life, especially in certain ecological and evolutionary contexts. Key concepts in sympatric speciation: no geographic isolation. Sympatric speciation occurs in the absence of any physical or geographic barriers. All individuals in the population are still within the same geographic area, but they evolve separately due to other mechanisms. Ecological differentiation. One of the most significant mechanisms driving sympatric speciation is ecological differentiation. This occurs when a population exploits different ecological niches within the same environment. For example, certain individuals might adapt to different types of food sources, microhabitats, or other environmental factors. Over time, this ecological specialization leads to reproductive isolation, even without physical barriers. Genetic mutations and polyploidy. Genetic mutations, such as polyploidy, where an organism gains multiple sets of chromosomes, can lead to sympatric speciation. Polyploid individuals are typically unable to interbreed with their diploid ancestors because their chromosome numbers are incompatible, which results in reproductive isolation. Polyploidy is particularly common in plants but can also occur in animals. Reproductive isolation mechanisms. Sympatric speciation requires reproductive isolation, even without geographic separation. This can occur through temporal isolation, different mating times within the same area, e.g., different breeding seasons. Behavioral isolation, differences in mating rituals or preferences, e.g., birds with different song patterns. Genetic isolation, genetic incompatibilities may arise due to mutations that cause reproductive barriers. Disruptive selection. Disruptive selection is a form of natural selection that can facilitate sympatric speciation. It occurs when extreme phenotypes at both ends of a spectrum have higher fitness than intermediate phenotypes. Over time, this results in the divergence of a population into two distinct groups, each adapted to different environmental factors or ecological niches. Mechanisms driving sympatric speciation: polyploidy. Polyploidy is one of the most well-documented mechanisms of sympatric speciation, especially in plants. Polyploid organisms have more than two sets of chromosomes, often due to errors in cell division. This can result in reproductive isolation because polyploid individuals cannot interbreed with their diploid ancestors, forming a new species. Polyploidy can occur through autopolyploidy, where an individual organism doubles its own chromosome number. Allopolyploidy, where hybridization between two different species results in a fertile polyploid organism. Ecological specialization. In some cases, different subgroups within a population adapt to different ecological niches. For example, fish in a lake might begin to exploit different feeding habits, such as consuming different types of food, e.g., algae versus insects, and over time, this ecological divergence can result in reproductive isolation and speciation. Sexual selection. Sexual selection can drive sympatric speciation if certain traits become preferred by mates within specific subgroups of the population. For example, if individuals with certain color patterns or mating behaviors preferentially mate with others displaying similar traits, this can lead to reproductive isolation. Over time, this can result in the divergence of populations within the same area. Behavioral isolation. Behavioral isolation can also promote sympatric speciation, where differences in mating behavior or other behaviors reduce gene flow. For example, in some species of frogs, different calls during mating seasons can prevent individuals from different subgroups from mating, leading to reproductive isolation and the formation of new species. Examples of sympatric speciation: cichlid fish in African lakes. In African lakes such as Lake Victoria and Lake Tanganyika, cichlid fish have undergone sympatric speciation. Within the same lake, different species of cichlids have specialized to exploit different feeding niches, such as different types of prey or different levels of the water column. This ecological divergence has led to the development of new species without geographic isolation. Apple maggot fly, Rhagoletis pomonella. The apple maggot fly is a classic example of sympatric speciation driven by ecological and behavioral changes. Originally, this species fed on hawthorn trees, but some flies began to exploit apple trees as a new food source. This new ecological niche led to the formation of two subpopulations that evolved differences in timing of reproduction and other behaviors, eventually resulting in speciation. Lake of Poyo cichlids, Nicaragua. In Lake Apoyo in Nicaragua, cichlid species have undergone sympatric speciation in response to differences in ecological niches. These fish live in the same lake, but they specialize in different feeding strategies, which has led to the emergence of multiple species over time. Strengths and evidence for sympatric speciation. Genetic evidence. Genetic studies have identified distinct genetic differences between sympatric species, even though they live in the same area. This supports the idea that genetic divergence can occur without geographic separation. Ecological evidence. Evidence of ecological differentiation, such as resource partitioning, provides strong support for sympatric speciation, especially in cases where species exploit different ecological niches. Fossil evidence. Fossil records showing the divergence of species in the same environment over time provide additional support for sympatric speciation. Challenges in sympatric speciation. Difficulty in identifying sympatric speciation. Sympatric speciation can be difficult to identify, as it requires evidence of reproductive isolation in populations that live in the same geographic area. It can sometimes be hard to distinguish from allopatric speciation, especially in the early stages. Ecological and behavioral factors. While ecological differentiation can drive sympatric speciation, it requires specific conditions, such as the availability of distinct ecological niches or strong sexual selection pressures. Practice question 1, GATE 2018. Which of the following is a mechanism that can lead to sympatric speciation? A. Geographic isolation. B. Temporal isolation. C. Polyploidy. D. Geographic barrier formation. Answer. The correct answer is C. Polyploidy. Polyploidy is a primary mechanism that can drive sympatric speciation, especially in plants, where individuals with extra sets of chromosomes become reproductively isolated from the parental population. Practice question 2, GATE 2020. Sympatric speciation occurs when? A. A population is split by a physical barrier into two isolated subpopulations. B. Two populations diverge due to different ecological niches within the same area. C. Two populations are geographically separated and do not interbreed. D. Reproductive isolation develops due to genetic drift alone. Answer. Correct answer is B. Two populations diverge due to different ecological niches within the same area. Sympatric speciation occurs when new species arise within the same geographic area due to ecological, behavioral, or genetic differences that reduce gene flow between subpopulations. Summary. Sympatric speciation is the process by which new species arise within the same geographic area without any physical barriers. It can be driven by mechanisms such as ecological differentiation, polyploidy, sexual selection, and behavioral isolation. While it is less common than allopatric speciation, it plays an important role in the diversification of species, particularly in environments with a variety of ecological niches. Evidence from cichlid fish in African lakes and apple maggot flies highlights how sympatric speciation can occur in natural populations. Let me know if you'd like to proceed with further topics or more practice questions. You said, next. ChatGPT said, ChatGPT. Parapatric speciation, detailed explanation. Parapatric speciation is a type of speciation that occurs when two populations of a species become distinct while maintaining a partial geographic overlap. Unlike allopatric speciation, where populations are geographically separated, or sympatric speciation, where populations live in the same area but are isolated by ecological factors, parapatric speciation occurs in adjacent, but not entirely overlapping, habitats. This often results from selective pressures that cause divergent adaptation along an environmental gradient, such as changes in temperature, altitude, or availability of resources. Key concepts in parapatric speciation, adjacent populations. In parapatric speciation, the two populations are adjacent, but there is not complete geographic overlap. There may be a narrow contact zone where gene flow still occurs, but it is limited by differences in environmental conditions or selection pressures. Environmental gradient. A key factor in parapatric speciation is the environmental gradient. This gradient can be a physical change in habitat, such as different soil types, vegetation, or temperature. The populations experience different selective pressures across this gradient, which can lead to adaptive divergence. Reduced gene flow. While populations are not completely isolated, gene flow between them is reduced due to differences in the environment and selective pressures. This reduction in gene flow leads to the accumulation of genetic differences, which may eventually lead to reproductive isolation and speciation. Selection and adaptation. Parapatric speciation is often driven by disruptive or divergent natural selection. The populations may adapt to different parts of the environmental gradient, leading to reproductive isolation. Over time, these adaptations can result in genetic changes that prevent interbreeding even if the populations are still geographically adjacent. Reproductive isolation. Even in the presence of a contact zone, reproductive isolation mechanisms evolve. These mechanisms include differences in mating behavior, timing, or genetic incompatibilities. The populations may still interact in the contact zone but will increasingly avoid interbreeding due to these isolating mechanisms. Mechanisms driving parapatric speciation, environmental differentiation. One of the primary drivers of parapatric speciation is environmental differentiation. For example, a population of plants might inhabit a range of soils that vary in pH, moisture, or nutrients. Different individuals may be better adapted to specific soil types, and over time, these subgroups may evolve distinct characteristics. Disruptive selection. Disruptive selection plays a crucial role in parapatric speciation. In this type of selection, individuals with extreme traits have higher fitness than those with intermediate traits. This can lead to two distinct phenotypic groups within the same population. For example, in a population where two types of food are available, e.g., large seeds and small seeds, individuals with either large beaks or small beaks would have an advantage, while those with intermediate-sized beaks would have lower fitness. Hybrid zones. A common feature of parapatric speciation is the hybrid zone. This is a region where two populations that have diverged genetically come into contact and hybridize. Hybrid zones can be stable or transient, depending on the fitness of hybrid offspring. If hybrids are less fit than purebred individuals, reinforcement natural selection may lead to stronger reproductive isolation over time. Reinforcement. Reinforcement is a process that occurs in hybrid zones where natural selection increases reproductive isolation between two populations. When hybrid offspring are less fit than individuals from either of the parental populations, natural selection favors traits that reduce hybridization. This reinforces speciation by enhancing reproductive isolation. Examples of parapatric speciation: steelhead trout, Oncorhynchus mykiss. In some river systems, steelhead trout exhibit parapatric speciation due to differences in the environmental conditions along the river. One population of trout migrates to the ocean, while another stays in freshwater. While these populations live in adjacent habitats, the selective pressures favor different migratory behaviors, leading to genetic divergence. Zebra and horse. In some regions, zebras and horses come into contact and hybridize in a narrow region. However, they occupy slightly different ecological niches and have distinct behaviors, leading to the formation of distinct populations over time. Although gene flow occurs, it is limited, and reinforcement can strengthen reproductive isolation. Belding's ground squirrel. Belding's ground squirrel exhibits parapatric speciation due to environmental gradients. Different populations living in adjacent areas with different climates and selective pressures may diverge over time, leading to reproductive isolation despite the lack of a physical barrier. Strengths and evidence for parapatric speciation, genetic divergence in overlapping populations. Genetic studies have shown that populations living in adjacent areas may evolve distinct genetic traits, despite limited interbreeding. This provides evidence for parapatric speciation in nature. Hybrid zones. Hybrid zones provide strong evidence for parapatric speciation. The existence of hybrid zones, where populations come into contact and interbreed, shows that speciation can occur even when populations are not geographically isolated. Reproductive isolation in contact zones. Observations of behavioral and ecological differences between populations in contact zones support the idea that reproductive isolation can evolve despite geographic overlap. In these zones, assortative mating and behavioral isolation mechanisms can develop. Challenges in parapatric speciation. Difficulty in identifying parapatric speciation. It is often difficult to distinguish parapatric speciation from other forms of speciation, especially when the contact zone is narrow or hybridization occurs frequently. The gradual nature of the divergence makes it challenging to pinpoint the exact moment when speciation occurs. Gene flow complications. While gene flow is reduced in parapatric speciation, it does not stop entirely. This partial gene flow can slow down the divergence of populations and make it more difficult to establish clear-cut boundaries between species. Practice question 1, Gate 2019. In parapatric speciation, populations diverge due to A. Geographic isolation. B. Ecological differentiation along an environmental gradient. C. Complete reproductive isolation. D. The formation of a hybrid zone. Answer. The correct answer is B. Ecological differentiation along an environmental gradient. Parapatric speciation occurs when populations experience different selective pressures due to environmental gradients, leading to divergence despite geographic proximity. Practice question 2, Gate 2017. In which of the following cases can parapatric speciation occur? A. Populations are separated by a geographic barrier. B. Populations diverge in different ecological niches without complete isolation. C. A population splits into two isolated populations. D. Two populations undergo complete reproductive isolation due to hybridization. Answer. The correct answer is B. Populations diverge in different ecological niches without complete isolation. Parapatric speciation occurs when populations diverge due to ecological differentiation within a shared geographic area, resulting in limited gene flow between them. Summary. Parapatric speciation is a form of speciation that occurs in adjacent populations living in different ecological niches within a continuous geographic area. It is driven by environmental gradients and selective pressures, leading to reproductive isolation despite the populations not being fully geographically isolated. Evidence from hybrid zones and genetic divergence in overlapping populations supports the concept of parapatric speciation, although it is often difficult to distinguish from other forms of speciation. Reinforcement and disruptive selection are important mechanisms in this process. Let me know if you'd like to continue with more topics or further practice questions. You said. Is there anyone left? ChatGPT said. ChatGPT. Yes, there are still a few more concepts within speciation left to cover. After parapatric speciation, we can discuss sympatric speciation, reinforcement, and hybrid zones. Would you like me to continue with those or focus on any specific topic you're interested in next? You said. Only leftovers. Let's move on. Sympatric speciation. Detailed explanation. Sympatric speciation occurs when new species arise within the same geographic area, without physical barriers separating the populations. This type of speciation is driven by other mechanisms, such as ecological differentiation, sexual selection, or polyploidy, that reduce gene flow between subgroups of the population even though they occupy the same environment. It is often considered more rare compared to other forms of speciation, as the populations need to evolve significant differences to avoid interbreeding within the same geographic area. Key concepts in sympatric speciation. No geographic isolation. Unlike allopatric or parapatric speciation, sympatric speciation does not involve physical barriers. The diverging populations live in the same geographic area but are reproductively isolated through other mechanisms. Ecological differentiation. One of the main drivers of sympatric speciation is ecological differentiation. This occurs when a population utilizes different resources or habitats within the same area, leading to the formation of subgroups with different ecological preferences. For example, two groups of insects might live in the same forest but feed on different types of plants. Over time, they may evolve into distinct species due to reduced interbreeding. Disruptive selection. Disruptive selection plays a significant role in sympatric speciation. It occurs when individuals with extreme traits, either large or small, have higher fitness than those with intermediate traits. For instance, in a population of fish living in a lake with both shallow and deep waters, fish adapted to each depth may become reproductively isolated, even though they live in the same lake. Sexual selection. Sexual selection can also drive sympatric speciation. If individuals from different subgroups prefer mates with specific traits, such as color or behavior, these preferences can reduce gene flow between subgroups. Over time, these preferences can result in reproductive isolation and speciation. Polyploidy. Polyploidy, particularly in plants, is a well-known mechanism of sympatric speciation. Polyploidy occurs when an individual inherits more than two sets of chromosomes, often leading to immediate reproductive isolation from the parent population. This can happen due to errors during cell division, such as non-disjunction, and result in offspring that are incapable of mating with the original population. Examples of sympatric speciation. Cichlid fish in African lakes. In some African lakes, cichlid fish have undergone sympatric speciation. Different populations of cichlids have adapted to different niches in the lake, such as feeding on different types of prey, leading to ecological differentiation. In some cases, sexual selection has also played a role, with females preferring males with certain colors or features, contributing to reproductive isolation. Apple maggot fly, Rhagoletis pomonella. The apple maggot fly is a classic example of sympatric speciation. Originally, these flies infested hawthorn trees. However, some individuals began infesting apple trees, leading to temporal and ecological isolation from the original population. Over time, these two populations diverged and exhibited traits like different mating times and preferences for different host plants, leading to reproductive isolation. Polyploidy in plants. Many plant species have undergone sympatric speciation through polyploidy. An example is the wheat plant Triticum spp, which arose through multiple instances of polyploidy, resulting in species that could not reproduce with their diploid ancestors, thus leading to speciation. Mechanisms driving sympatric speciation. Ecological niche differentiation. Sympatric speciation often begins when a population adapts to different ecological niches within the same geographic area. For example, some individuals may specialize in one type of food or habitat, while others specialize in a different one. Over time, these individuals become reproductively isolated due to different ecological preferences. Disruptive selection. In the presence of multiple ecological niches, disruptive selection can favor extreme traits that help individuals adapt to specific environments. For instance, in a population of birds, individuals with either very large or very small beaks may be better suited to accessing specific food sources, leading to reproductive isolation and divergence. Sexual selection. When mate choice is based on certain traits, such as coloration or behavioral displays, sexual selection can reduce gene flow between different subgroups of the population. Over time, this can lead to the evolution of reproductive isolation. Polyploidy in plants. Polyploidy is one of the most immediate forms of sympatric speciation. When an organism's chromosome number doubles, it can no longer successfully mate with the original population, effectively creating a new species. This is commonly seen in plants, where polyploidy can arise through errors in meiosis or mitosis. Practice question 1, GATE 2020. Which of the following is a characteristic of sympatric speciation? A. Geographic isolation of populations. B. Divergence due to environmental differences. C. Reproductive isolation without geographic separation. D. Genetic drift due to small population size. Answer. The correct answer is C. Reproductive isolation without geographic separation. Sympatric speciation occurs when populations become reproductively isolated while living in the same geographic area, typically through ecological differentiation, sexual selection, or polyploidy. Practice question 2, GATE 2018. In the case of sympatric speciation, reproductive isolation may arise due to A. Temporal isolation only. B. Geographical barriers. C. Ecological differences or polyploidy. D. Natural selection favoring intermediate forms. Answer. The correct answer is C. Ecological differences or polyploidy. Sympatric speciation can occur through ecological differentiation or polyploidy, which leads to reproductive isolation despite the populations living in the same geographic area. Summary. Sympatric speciation occurs when populations become reproductively isolated within the same geographic area. It can be driven by ecological differentiation, sexual selection, and polyploidy, among other factors. Unlike allopatric and parapatric speciation, sympatric speciation does not require physical barriers to gene flow but results from selective pressures that cause divergence in traits and preferences within the same environment. It is most commonly seen in organisms with complex mating behaviors, plants with polyploidy, or species with ecological niches that promote divergence. If you'd like to continue with the final speciation mechanism or need more clarifications, let me know. UED, next. ChatGPT said, ChatGPT. Reinforcement, detailed explanation. Reinforcement is a process by which natural selection strengthens reproductive isolation between two populations that are diverging, particularly in the case where there is some initial hybridization. This concept is part of the process of speciation, often occurring when two populations that are in the early stages of diverging come into contact again and produce hybrids. If those hybrids have lower fitness than individuals from either parental population, reinforcement acts to favor the evolution of traits that reduce hybridization and maintain reproductive isolation. Key concepts in reinforcement: hybrid fitness and reproductive isolation. Reinforcement occurs when hybrid offspring are less fit than individuals from the parental populations, which leads to the evolution of traits that promote reproductive isolation. For example, if two diverging populations produce hybrid offspring with lower survival or fertility, selection will favor individuals that are less likely to mate with individuals from the other population, thus avoiding producing hybrids. Prezygotic barriers. The primary result of reinforcement is the strengthening of prezygotic barriers to reproduction. These are mechanisms that prevent fertilization from occurring in the first place. These can include behavioral isolation, differences in mating behaviors or signals, e.g., mating calls, courtship rituals. Mechanical isolation, differences in reproductive organs that prevent successful mating. Temporal isolation, reproductive isolation based on differences in mating seasons or times of day. Ecological isolation, differences in habitat preferences. Postzygotic isolation. While reinforcement focuses on prezygotic isolation, it is often a response to postzygotic isolation, where hybrid offspring are sterile or have reduced fitness. In cases of hybrid breakdown or low hybrid fitness, reinforcement promotes traits that limit hybridization and further enhance reproductive isolation. Speciation continuum. Reinforcement typically occurs after some level of divergence has already taken place. This process is not necessarily the initiation of speciation but rather a refinement of reproductive isolation between two already diverging populations. Examples of reinforcement: Drosophila species. In Drosophila, some species have been observed to have distinct mating behaviors and courtship rituals. When hybridization between two species occurs, the resultant hybrids often show reduced fitness. Over time, natural selection favors traits, such as changes in mating behavior, that reduce the likelihood of interbreeding and reinforce reproductive isolation between the species. Frogs in Central America. In some species frogs in Central America, reinforcement is thought to have occurred due to the hybridization of two species. The hybrids produced by these species were less fit, so behavioral differences that discouraged interbreeding evolved. This led to the maintenance of distinct species, with selection favoring individuals who preferred mates from the same species. Cichlids in African lakes. Some African cichlids in Lake Victoria show evidence of reinforcement. When populations of cichlids diverge and start hybridizing, the resultant hybrids may suffer from poor fitness. Selection against hybridization increases the likelihood of traits evolving that prevent mating between the two populations, such as changes in mating coloration and behavioral preferences. Mechanisms of reinforcement: selection against hybrids. If hybrid offspring have lower fitness due to factors such as sterility, low survival, or behavioral incompatibility, natural selection will favor individuals that avoid hybridizing with individuals from other populations. This drives the evolution of traits that increase reproductive isolation. Strengthening prezygotic barriers. The evolution of stronger prezygotic barriers is the hallmark of reinforcement. These barriers could be behavioral, morphological, or ecological, and they serve to minimize the likelihood of mating between diverging populations, thus preventing hybrid offspring from being produced. Feedback loop. There can be a feedback loop between reinforcement and divergence. As populations diverge, reinforcement strengthens reproductive isolation, which in turn further accelerates the divergence of the populations. Over time, this can lead to complete speciation. Practice question 1, GATE 2019. Reinforcement is a process that A. Increases hybrid fitness through postzygotic mechanisms. B. Strengthens prezygotic barriers to reproduction in hybridizing populations. C. Involves the physical separation of populations due to geographic isolation. D. Leads to the breakdown of reproductive isolation in closely related species. Answer. The correct answer is B. Strengthens prezygotic barriers to reproduction in hybridizing populations. Reinforcement strengthens prezygotic barriers to reproduction, thereby reducing hybridization and promoting the maintenance of reproductive isolation. Practice question 2, GATE 2017. Which of the following is a key factor in reinforcement during speciation? A. High gene flow between diverging populations. B. Hybridization leading to the production of fertile offspring. C. Selection favoring traits that reduce hybridization. D. Physical separation of populations through geographic isolation. Answer. The correct answer is C. Selection favoring traits that reduce hybridization. Reinforcement occurs when natural selection favors traits that prevent hybridization, thus promoting reproductive isolation. Summary. Reinforcement is a process in speciation where natural selection strengthens reproductive isolation between two populations that are diverging, especially in response to hybridization. It acts by favoring traits that reduce hybridization, typically by enhancing prezygotic barriers like differences in mating behaviors or reproductive structures. The process helps ensure that diverging populations do not interbreed, thus maintaining the genetic integrity of each species. Reinforcement is most prominent when hybridization produces offspring with low fitness, and it plays a key role in finalizing reproductive isolation and completing the speciation process. Would you like to move on to hybrid zones, or do you have any questions about this topic? You said, next. ChatGPT said, ChatGPT. Hybrid zones, detailed explanation. Hybrid zones are regions where two closely related populations or species come into contact and interbreed, producing hybrid offspring. These zones are particularly important in understanding the process of speciation and the maintenance of reproductive isolation between species. Hybrid zones typically occur in areas where two populations that have diverged through processes like natural selection, genetic drift, or geographic isolation meet again and overlap. Key concepts in hybrid zones: hybridization and gene flow. Hybrid zones are characterized by the interbreeding of individuals from two distinct populations, leading to the production of hybrid offspring. Gene flow between the populations is often greater within the hybrid zone than in the peripheral populations. This gene flow can either reinforce or weaken the reproductive isolation between the populations, depending on the fitness of the hybrids and the evolutionary forces at play. Types of hybrid zones. Hybrid zones can vary in terms of their stability and how long they last. They can be stable hybrid zones. These maintain a consistent area over time, with continued hybridization occurring between the two populations. Moving hybrid zones. These shift in space due to changes in environmental conditions or population dynamics. Transient hybrid zones. These are short-lived, forming when two populations come into contact but eventually disappear as the populations further diverge or are separated again. Outcome of hybridization. The outcome of hybridization in a hybrid zone can vary based on several factors. Reinforcement of reproductive isolation. If hybrids have low fitness, selection may favor individuals that avoid mating with individuals from the other population, reinforcing reproductive isolation. Fusion of species. If hybrid offspring are viable and fertile, and the populations experience ongoing gene flow, the hybrid zone may lead to the fusion of the two species into a single population. Stabilization of reproductive isolation. If hybrids have intermediate fitness, there may be a balance between hybridization and reproductive isolation, leading to long-lasting hybrid zones where both parental species and hybrids coexist. Hybrid zone dynamics. The dynamics within a hybrid zone can be influenced by various evolutionary processes, including selection against hybrids. If hybrid offspring suffer from reduced fitness due to factors such as infertility, low survival rates, or maladaptation to their environment, natural selection may reduce hybridization and maintain the boundaries between the species. Gene flow and integration. In some cases, gene flow between the populations may lead to integration, where genes from one population spread into the gene pool of the other population, potentially leading to genetic assimilation. Ecological factors. Ecological factors, such as habitat preferences and ecological niches, may influence the likelihood of hybridization in a hybrid zone. Role of hybrid zones in speciation. Hybrid zones provide important insights into the speciation process. They offer evidence of how reproductive isolation evolves, how gene flow operates between species, and whether hybridization can lead to the formation of new species. In some cases, hybrid zones may facilitate speciation by promoting the development of new hybrid genotypes that are better suited to specific environments, potentially leading to ecological or genetic divergence. Examples of hybrid zones. Hybrid zone in the Heliconius butterflies. A well-known example of a hybrid zone is found in the Heliconius butterflies in South America. Several species of Heliconius butterflies have overlapping ranges, and hybridization occurs at these contact zones. However, the hybrids often have reduced fitness due to their inability to survive in different environmental conditions, and natural selection helps reinforce reproductive isolation between species. Hybrid zones in salamanders, genus Ambystoma. In salamanders of the genus Ambystoma, hybrid zones occur where two species, such as Ambystoma lateral and Ambystoma texanum, come into contact. The hybrids in these zones exhibit a range of characteristics and fitness levels. In some cases, hybrids are viable and fertile, while in other cases, they suffer from reduced fitness. These hybrid zones are important in understanding how reproductive isolation evolves. Hybrid zone in cichlids in Lake Victoria. In Lake Victoria, there is a hybrid zone involving cichlid fish. Two species of cichlids, Pundamelia pundamelia and Pundamelia nairi, hybridize in a narrow region of the lake. The hybrids display a mix of parental traits, and this hybrid zone has been crucial for understanding how ecological factors and mate preferences influence reproductive isolation in fish. Hybrids display a mix of parental traits, and this hybrid zone has been crucial for understanding how ecological factors and mate preferences influence reproductive isolation in fish. Mechanisms in hybrid zones. Reinforcement. In many hybrid zones, reinforcement occurs when natural selection favors individuals that avoid mating with hybrids or individuals from the other species. If hybrids have low fitness, selection will favor traits that promote associative mating, reducing hybridization and further strengthening reproductive isolation. Hybrid vigor, heterosis. In some cases, hybrid offspring may exhibit hybrid vigor or heterosis, where hybrids are more fit than either of the parental populations. This can lead to the persistence or expansion of hybrid zones if hybrids have a selective advantage in the hybrid zone environment. Integration. Integration refers to the movement of alleles from one species to another through hybridization. If hybrids are fertile and interbreed with one of the parent species, alleles from the hybrid lineage may enter the gene pool of one of the parental species, leading to the spread of novel alleles. Gene flow versus selection. The interplay between gene flow, exchange of genetic material, and selection, natural selection favoring certain traits, determines the future of a hybrid zone. If selection acts strongly against hybrids, gene flow will be restricted, and the hybrid zone may diminish. If hybrids are fit and fertile, gene flow can lead to the fusion of species. Practice question 1, GATE 2020. In hybrid zones, which of the following can lead to the reinforcement of reproductive isolation? Selection favoring hybrids. B. Selection against hybrids due to lower fitness. C. Increase in gene flow between the populations. D. Complete fusion of the two populations. Answer. The correct answer is B. Selection against hybrids due to lower fitness. Hybrid zones. Reinforcement occurs when hybrids have lower fitness than parental individuals, leading to selection favoring traits that reduce hybridization and reinforce reproductive isolation. Practice question 2, GATE 2018. Which of the following best describes the outcome of hybridization in a hybrid zone? A. The two populations will eventually become one through gene flow. B. The hybrid zone leads to the creation of a new species. C. Gene flow may either reinforce, reduce, or prevent reproductive isolation between the populations. D. Hybridization always results in infertile offspring and complete reproductive isolation. Answer. Correct answer is C. Gene flow may either reinforce, reduce, or prevent reproductive isolation between the populations. In hybrid zones, gene flow can either strengthen reproductive isolation through reinforcement, weaken it through integration, or have no impact, depending on the fitness of hybrids and other factors. Summary. Hybrid zones are regions where two species or populations come into contact and interbreed, producing hybrid offspring. These zones provide valuable insights into the process of speciation, reproductive isolation, and evolutionary dynamics. The outcome of hybridization can vary, from the reinforcement of isolation to gene flow or even the fusion of species. The evolution of reproductive barriers in hybrid zones often involves selection against hybrids, reinforcement of isolation, and integration of genes. Understanding hybrid zones is crucial for studying how species diverge and how gene flow operates in the context of speciation. Feel free to ask if you need any more explanations or would like to continue with other topics. You said, adaptive radiation. ChatGPT said, ChatGPT. Adaptive radiation. Detailed explanation. Adaptive radiation is the evolutionary process in which a single ancestral species rapidly diversifies into a wide range of forms to exploit different ecological niches. This diversification occurs in response to different selective pressures in various environments. Adaptive radiation is typically observed when a species colonizes a new area with a variety of unoccupied niches, or when a major environmental change opens up new opportunities for adaptation. Key concepts in adaptive radiation. Ecological opportunity. Adaptive radiation often occurs when a population encounters ecological opportunity, a situation where there are unoccupied ecological niches or environmental conditions that allow for the rapid diversification of species. This can occur due to the colonization of an uninhabited area, such as an island or newly formed habitat. The extinction of competitors, which opens up new ecological spaces. A major environmental change, such as the development of new landforms or climate changes, that alters available resources or selective pressures. Diversification of traits. In adaptive radiation, species that arise from a common ancestor often show divergence in morphological, physiological, or behavioral traits. These traits are adapted to different ecological niches, allowing the species to exploit various food sources, habitats, or reproductive strategies. The resulting species often look very different from one another despite sharing a common ancestry. Rapid speciation. Adaptive radiation is characterized by rapid speciation, where the number of species increases quickly over a relatively short period of evolutionary time. This speciation can happen through mechanisms such as allopatric speciation, where geographic isolation leads to reproductive isolation. Sympatric speciation, where reproductive isolation occurs without geographic separation, often due to ecological divergence within the same area. Common causes of adaptive radiation. Island colonization. Isolated environments like islands often provide opportunities for adaptive radiation. The absence of competitors and predators allows species to diversify rapidly to fill various ecological niches. Mass extinction events. After a mass extinction, surviving species may experience a burst of diversification to fill the ecological gaps left by extinct species. Ecological diversification. A change in environmental conditions or the development of new habitats can lead to adaptive radiation as species adapt to the new niches available. Key features of adaptive radiation. Common ancestry. All species involved in an adaptive radiation originate from a single common ancestor. Diversification in form and function. Species adapt to different ecological roles, leading to a variety of morphological, behavioral, and physiological adaptations. Rapid speciation. The process occurs over a relatively short time period, often leading to the formation of a large number of new species. Famous examples of adaptive radiation. Darwin's finches, Galapagos Islands. One of the most famous examples of adaptive radiation is seen in the Darwin's finches on the Galapagos Islands. A single species of finch that colonized the islands adapted to different ecological niches by evolving different beak shapes and sizes to exploit various food sources. These adaptations allow the finches to specialize in different diets, seeds, insects, etc., leading to the formation of multiple distinct species from a common ancestor. Hawaiian honeycreepers. The Hawaiian honeycreepers are another example of adaptive radiation. These birds, which evolved from a single ancestor species, diversified into over 50 different species, each adapted to specific ecological roles such as nectar feeding, insect feeding, and seed eating. The Hawaiian Islands' isolation in the variety of ecological niches facilitated this rapid diversification. Cichlid fishes in African lakes. Cichlid fishes in East African lakes like Lake Victoria and Lake Tanganyika are examples of adaptive radiation. These lakes have thousands of cichlid species that have evolved to fill various ecological niches, such as herbivores, carnivores, and detritivores. These fishes exhibit vast morphological and behavioral diversity, including differences in body shape, mouth structure, and feeding strategies. Mammalian radiation after the dinosaur extinction. After the extinction of the dinosaurs around 65 million years ago, mammals underwent an adaptive radiation, diversifying into a wide variety of forms, from small insectivores to large herbivores and carnivores. This radiation led to the rise of modern mammalian orders such as primates, carnivores, and rodents, occupying a range of ecological niches previously filled by dinosaurs. Mechanisms driving adaptive radiation. Ecological niche expansion. As a population enters a new habitat, they often face a variety of new ecological niches. Over time, individuals within the population adapt to these niches by developing unique traits that enable them to exploit the resources in their new environment. This ecological diversification drives the formation of multiple species. Competition and resource partitioning. In the presence of multiple species, competition for resources can lead to resource partitioning, the division of available resources among species in ways that reduce competition. For example, different species may evolve to feed on different types of food or to occupy different areas of the habitat. This reduces competition and encourages speciation. Sexual selection. Sexual selection can also play a role in adaptive radiation, as different species may evolve distinct mating preferences or courtship behaviors. This can drive divergence between populations as individuals select mates based on different traits, further promoting speciation. Mutations and genetic drift. In isolated populations, mutations can lead to new genetic variations that are not present in the ancestral population. Genetic drift, random changes in allele frequencies, can also contribute to speciation, especially in small, isolated populations. Conditions favoring adaptive radiation. Geographic isolation. Populations that are geographically isolated, e.g., islands, mountain ranges, are more likely to undergo adaptive radiation because they are not in direct competition with similar species. Availability of unoccupied niches. When ecological niches are available, organisms can diversify to exploit these new opportunities, leading to rapid speciation. Lack of predators. In the absence of predators, species can occupy a variety of niches and diversify quickly, as there are fewer selective pressures to limit population growth. Practice question 1, GATE 2020. Which of the following is a characteristic of adaptive radiation? A. Slow diversification of a species into various forms. B. Diversification of species due to environmental changes or the availability of new niches. C. Evolutionary change due to the extinction of species. D. A single species forming a single new species through natural selection. Answer. The correct answer is B. Diversification of species due to environmental changes or the availability of new niches. Adaptive radiation is characterized by the rapid diversification of species into various forms, driven by the availability of ecological niches or environmental changes. Practice question 2, GATE 2018. Which of the following is a well-known example of adaptive radiation? A. The evolution of distinct beak shapes in Darwin's finches. B. The evolution of complex traits in primates. C. The development of resistance in bacteria. D. The development of different colors in a population due to genetic drift. Answer. The correct answer is at the evolution of distinct beak shapes in Darwin's finches. Darwin's finches on the Galapagos Islands are a classic example of adaptive radiation, where a single ancestral species diversified into multiple species with different beak shapes and sizes to exploit different food sources. Summary. Adaptive radiation is the process by which a single ancestral species rapidly diversifies into a wide array of forms, each adapted to different ecological niche. This phenomenon is driven by ecological opportunities, competition, environmental changes, and resource availability. Famous examples include Darwin's finches, Hawaiian honeycreepers, and cichlids in African lakes. Adaptive radiation is a key mechanism for understanding speciation and the evolution of biodiversity, demonstrating how organisms can rapidly adapt to a variety of ecological roles in response to environmental conditions. Let me know if you need further explanations or practice questions. You said, convergence, ChatGPT said, ChatGPT. Convergence, detailed explanation. Convergence, also known as convergent evolution, is the process by which unrelated or distantly related organisms independently evolve similar traits or adaptations due to similar environmental pressures or ecological niches. Despite these organisms not sharing a recent common ancestor, they develop similar characteristics or solutions to similar problems posed by their environments. Key concepts in convergence: independent evolution of similar traits. Convergence occurs when different species from different evolutionary lineages develop similar characteristics. This happens when they occupy similar environments and face similar selective pressures, such as the need to move fast, hunt prey, or survive in harsh conditions. These adaptations arise through natural selection, but the species do not share a direct evolutionary relationship that would account for these similarities. Ecological pressures and niche occupation. Organisms in similar ecological niches often face the same set of challenges. For example, animals in cold climates may evolve similar body shapes or fur thickness to conserve heat, even if they are not closely related. This ecological similarity drives convergent evolution. Traits involved in convergence. Convergence can occur in various traits such as morphology, similar body structures, such as wings in bats, birds, and insects, despite their very different evolutionary histories. Physiology, similar physiological mechanisms, such as the ability of different animals to use echolocation, seen in bats and dolphins. Behavior, similar behaviors in different species, such as hunting strategies used by predators in different environments. Adaptations to similar environmental challenges. The driving force behind convergent evolution is the adaptation to similar environmental challenges. This could be the need to survive in environments with limited resources, extreme temperatures, or specialized feeding behavior. Famous examples of convergent evolution: wings in bats, birds, and insects. Evolution of wings in bats, birds, and insects is one of the most well-known examples of convergent evolution. Despite these organisms coming from different evolutionary lineages, they have developed wings to achieve flight, an adaptation that offers similar advantages such as the ability to find food and avoid predators. Streamlined bodies in dolphins and fish. Dolphins, mammals, and fish vertebrates have evolved similar streamlined body shapes to move efficiently through water. This shared characteristic is a result of the ecological pressures of living in aquatic environments, despite the fact that dolphins and fish come from vastly different evolutionary ancestors. Cacti and euphorbia. The cactus native to the Americas and the euphorbia found in Africa and Asia are examples of plant species that have developed similar forms in response to living in arid environments. Both plants have thick, succulent stems that store water, and their spines are modified leaves that reduce water loss. Despite their similar appearance, they belong to entirely different plant families. Echolocation in bats and dolphins. Both bats and dolphins use echolocation for navigation and hunting, but these two groups evolved echolocation independently. Bats use echolocation to locate prey in the dark, while dolphins use it to navigate murky waters. The ability to produce and interpret sound waves is a key trait for survival in their respective environments. Eyes of vertebrates and cephalopods. The eye vertebrates, like humans, and cephalopods, like octopuses and squids, have evolved to perform similar functions, such as detecting light and forming images. These eyes are structurally similar in many ways but have evolved independently, showcasing how similar environmental needs, visual processing, can lead to the development of similar structures. Organisms driving convergent evolution. Similar environmental pressures. When organisms occupy similar habitats or face similar challenges, e.g., predation, temperature extremes, limited resources, natural selection may favor similar adaptations that provide a survival advantage. These adaptations can arise independently in unrelated species. Niche specialization. Organisms in the same ecological niche, such as predators in open water, often evolve similar strategies for hunting or surviving. For example, fast-running carnivores, like cheetahs and greyhounds, exhibit similar body shapes to optimize their speed, even though they evolved from different ancestors. Functional constraints. Some traits are so functionally beneficial that they arise repeatedly across different evolutionary lineages. For example, the development of vision in different animal groups, or flight in birds, bats, and insects, arises because these adaptations are highly advantageous for survival. Genetic and developmental constraints. Evolutionary convergence is also influenced by the available genetic and developmental pathways in different species. These constraints can guide species toward similar solutions even when they are genetically and phylogenetically distant from one another. Convergence versus divergence. Convergence involves the independent evolution of similar traits in species from different evolutionary lineages due to similar selective pressures. The organisms involved do not share a recent common ancestor. Divergence refers to the process by which two or more related species evolve different traits due to different selective pressures or environmental factors. Divergence is typically seen in species that share a recent common ancestor. Why is convergent evolution important? Insight into evolutionary constraints. Convergent evolution provides insight into the evolutionary constraints that guide the development of similar traits in unrelated species. It helps researchers understand how organisms adapt to similar challenges in similar ways, shedding light on the role of natural selection in shaping biodiversity. Understanding evolutionary solutions. By studying convergent evolution, scientists can identify the best solutions that evolution has selected for overcoming specific challenges. For example, understanding how different organisms evolve flight or vision can inform our knowledge of how complex traits evolve over time. Conservation implications. Convergent traits may indicate that certain evolutionary pathways are common solutions to environmental pressures, which can be important when considering species conservation. It helps scientists understand how similar traits may be beneficial in similar habitats, even if the species involved are different. Practice question 1, GATE 2019, which of the following is an example of convergent evolution? A. The development of wings in bats and birds. B. The diversification of finch species in the Galapagos Islands. C. The evolution of different beak shapes in Darwin's finches. D. The formation of distinct species in different geographic locations. Answer. The correct answer is at the development of wings in bats and birds. This is an example of convergent evolution, as both bats and birds evolve wings independently to solve the same problem, flight, even though they do not share a recent common ancestor. Practice question 2, GATE 2017, the similar body shape of dolphins and fish is an example of A. Divergent evolution. B. Convergent evolution. C. Parallel evolution. D. Co-evolution. Answer. The correct answer is B. Convergent evolution. Dolphins and fish have similar body shapes due to their adaptation to an aquatic environment, despite being from different evolutionary lineages. Summary. Convergent evolution occurs when unrelated species evolve similar traits due to similar environmental pressures or ecological niches. Examples of convergent evolution include the evolution of wings in bats and birds, the streamlined bodies of dolphins and fish, and the development of echolocation in bats and dolphins. Convergence highlights how natural selection can lead to similar adaptations in different species, offering insights into how organisms solve similar survival challenges. Let me know if you need more examples or clarification on this topic. You said, biogeography. 2 halves. ChatGPT said, ChatGPT. Biogeography, detailed explanation. Biogeography is the scientific study of the distribution of species in ecosystems in geographic space and through geological time. It combines elements of ecology, evolutionary biology, and geology to understand why certain species are found in particular regions and how they evolved over time in response to environmental factors. Key concepts in biogeography: geographic distribution of species. Biogeography seeks to explain the distribution patterns of organisms across the Earth. This involves studying both the current and historical factors that influence species distributions, including geological events, climatic conditions, and ecological interactions. Types of biogeography. Historical biogeography focuses on the evolutionary history and processes that have shaped the distribution of species over time. It includes the study of continental drift, glaciations, and the geological events that have isolated populations and led to speciation. Ecological biogeography studies the relationship between species distributions and environmental factors, e.g., climate, habitat types, and ecological interactions in the present day. It focuses on understanding how species adapt to their environments and how environmental changes affect these patterns. Principles of biogeography. Dispersal, the movement of species from their place of origin to new areas. Dispersal can occur via active movement, e.g., migration, or passive movement, e.g., wind, water, or animal transport. Vicariance, the splitting of a species range due to geographic or environmental barriers, e.g., mountain ranges, rivers, or continental drift. Over time, these isolated populations may evolve into distinct species. Barriers to dispersal, physical or ecological barriers, e.g., oceans, deserts, or mountain ranges that prevent the movement of species, leading to the differentiation of populations. Factors influencing biogeographical patterns. Geological events. The movement of tectonic plates, the formation and breakup of continents, and volcanic activity have played significant roles in shaping biogeographical patterns. For example, the Pangaea supercontinent about 200 million years ago broke apart, causing the species that lived in it to become geographically isolated. Climate. The climate has a major impact on species distribution. Temperature, precipitation, and seasonal variations determine which species can survive in particular regions. For example, polar regions support species adapted to cold climates, while tropical rainforests support species adapted to high humidity and warmth. Ecological interactions. The interactions between species, such as competition, predation, mutualism, etc., also influence biogeographical patterns. For instance, the presence of a dominant predator or competitor in a certain area can prevent other species from establishing themselves there. Evolution and speciation. Evolutionary processes, such as natural selection and genetic drift, contribute to species differentiation. For instance, isolated populations in different environments may evolve into distinct species through allopatric speciation. Major biogeographical realms. Biogeography divides the Earth into major biogeographical realms based on the distribution of species. These realms are large geographical regions with distinct plant and animal communities. Palearctic realm. The Palearctic realm includes Europe, Northern Asia, and North Africa. It has a diverse range of ecosystems, from temperate forests to deserts. It shares many species with the Nearctic and Indomalayan realms due to historical connections during past climate changes. Nearctic realm. The Nearctic realm includes North America and Greenland. It includes the study of continental drift, glaciations, and the geological events that have isolated populations and led to speciation. Ecological biogeography studies the relationship between species distributions and environmental factors, e.g., climate, habitat types, and ecological interactions in the present day. It focuses on understanding how species adapt to their environments and how environmental changes affect these patterns. Principles of biogeography. Dispersal, the movement of species from their place of origin to new areas. Dispersal can occur via active movement, e.g., migration, or passive movement, e.g., wind, water, or animal transport. Vicariance, the splitting of a species range due to geographic or environmental barriers, e.g., mountain ranges, rivers, or continental drift. Over time, these isolated populations may evolve into distinct species. Barriers to dispersal, physical or ecological barriers, e.g., oceans, deserts, or mountain ranges.